as you're doing historical research, you come across hundreds of facts, but sometimes a few of them stick. And I remember one of the most stunning moments of realization for me when it comes to race in the church happened on a visit that I took to Colonial Virginia. It was a museum in Williamsburg, and there was a plaque on the wall, and it said that in 1667, the Virginia Assembly passed a statute that essentially said if someone was baptized, it would not free them. The exact words were, "It is enacted by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom." And it was referring to Native Americans, Africans, and people of mixed race descent. Now, this fact stood out to me for two reasons. First of all, you have race, religion, and politics intertwined. And what that means is you can't draw these very sharp lines between these issues. Race, religion, and politics are all wrapped up in the same social bond. The second reason it stands out is that this is 1667. It's 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, more than a century before the ratification of the Constitution. These issues predate the political entity known as the United States. So guess what? There's never not a time in our nation's history when issues of racism and religion weren't intertwined in problematic ways. Now, what does this have to do with Christianity? Think about it. The Virginia Assembly was actually a group of Anglican white men. And so you had to be a member of a church in good standing if you wanted to serve in political office at this time. Moreover, they were violating what they already were used to. So English custom said that Christians could not enslave one another. But in North America, no such rules applied when it came to Native Americans or people of African descent in the colonies. But what stands out to me as well is this. They could have made another decision. Here's one big idea that you have to understand when we talk about the academic study of history. Nothing about American racism was inevitable. Historians talk about the idea of contingency. And it's the principle that individuals and groups have agency. They can make their own decisions, and despite what decisions they actually did make, oftentimes they could have made other decisions, and events would have unfolded differently. Contingency is a crucial idea for understanding race. Early in the years of European colonization of North America, colonists hadn't cemented the idea of skin color as an essential feature of society. Race was still being made. So this segment traces the early days of European contact with indigenous peoples of North America and the first days of slavery in the colonies. It shows how people with power chose dividends over dignity and laid the foundations for race-based stratification. But the idea of contingency also gives us hope. If people make deliberate decisions to enshrine racism in our nation's society, then it's possible that a series of better decisions could begin to change this reality. Let's go back to the beginning of European contact with North America. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all remember that, right? Well, let's dig a little bit deeper. After about 2 months of sailing, Columbus and his companions made landfall on the shores of the Western Atlantic. Mind you, this was not uninhabited land. There were thriving Native American tribes and cultures, but the idea is that race had to be constructed, socially constructed. Race actually has no basis in biology or the Bible. The amount of melanin in someone's skin does not determine their worth. The Bible doesn't set up some people as having more dignity than others. Meaning had to be made around skin color. It had to be created. But just because race is based on a myth doesn't mean it doesn't have real consequences. See, racial ideas formed over time, and we can begin to see this clearly in the colonial era. This is a period when people were still deciding how society would be organized. You can see the gradual growth of race as a determining factor of who gained advantages and disadvantages. So back to Columbus. We have some letters from his early days of contact with North America, and we can see from the start that there were some racist ideas embedded in them. So, when he looked at Native Americans, he described their appearance in relation to European features. And basically, what it boiled down to was the lighter the skin, the more preferable the people, because they looked more like Europeans. Now, it's not inherently racist to compare appearances, but Columbus goes on. So he saw the indigenous inhabitants and he thought they would be good servants. He says, they were intelligent, for I observed that they took in what I said to them, and I believed that they would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me they had no religion. Now break that down. He looked at Native Americans and evaluated their intelligence, but only in relation to how good of a servant they would be. He couldn't envision another role for them in society. And then he goes on to say that they could easily be made Christian, as if they didn't already have a sophisticated culture and cosmology and spirituality of their own. Now let's be clear. Native Americans did resist European colonization. Historian Richard White talks about the middle ground, and this is a period when whites could neither dictate to Indians nor ignore them. But Native Americans, of course, were eventually decimated by disease and war and displacement, and European colonization began to be a more prominent story in American history. Europeans colonized other lands for a purpose. It was to make money. European countries demanded more and more raw materials from their colonies, and in response, colonizers increasingly turned to slavery. Let's talk about slavery a little bit, because I'm concerned that when we say that word, too many of us fail to understand exactly what it looked like. We need to realize the toll in terms of human brutality and suffering that American race-based chattel slavery extracted on all involved, not just people of African descent. First, the demand for raw materials in the Americas fueled the growth in the slave trade. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but it's critical to realize that the pursuit of profit was the platform on which the edifice of slavery was built. Let's start with the so-called Middle Passage. This is the journey of enslaved persons on slave ships from the coast of Africa to places in South, Central, and North America. There's a process to enslavement, and the Middle Passage actually began before anyone stepped foot on a ship. You see, Europeans would get slaves from the continent of Africa, usually the western part of the continent. And to get slaves, they would barter with local African tribes for people who were captured in war, which was a common practice at the time, or they kidnapped their own people. And then they marched them, sometimes hundreds of miles, in chains and shackles to the coast. So already the sense of imprisonment and displacement and bondage is happening. And then they would take them to the coast and they would wait weeks in structures called factories, which were these fortress-like prisons designed to hold Africans until they were loaded onto ships. Now, there is some record of what this looked like, and we have this through the narratives that enslaved people wrote about their own lives. Now, one of these narratives stands out, and it's called The Narrative of the Life of Aola Uda Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa. Now, Equiano was born in 1745 in Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe in modern-day Nigeria, and he was kidnapped when he was about 11 years old, along with his sister. And he writes about the Middle Passage. Actually, he writes about when they were on the coast, and he said, the stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there anytime. And then he goes on to describe when you're on a ship like this, there's no place for the waste to go. And so they had these big tubs of excrement. And he describes that the children would often fall into these big tubs and were almost suffocated. Now, what's interesting is, in spite of all this, Equiano converted to Christianity. And he spoke of his experiences from a Christian framework. He talked about rape, and he said, it's a disgrace not only for Christians, but of men. I have even known them to gratify their brutal passion with females not yet 10 years old. Beyond that, he talked about kidnapping and separation from family. Like I said, he was kidnapped along with his sister, and when you enslaved people, it didn't matter if you were bonded, mother and children and wives and husbands, you could be separated. And Ola Uda Equiano said, O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? So he could see the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of people who professed to be Christian, yet treated people as property. Let's talk about someone who we all know, but you may not know you know him. You know probably the song Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound. Do you know who wrote it? It's a man named John Newton, and he's best known for penning that amazing hymn that we all sing in so many of these churches. What many people don't know is that he also served as a slave ship captain for several years. So, John Newton converted to Christianity in 1748, but he remained a slave ship captain until a stroke in 1754 forced him to retire from life on the sea. He went on to be a very well-known pastor, hymn writer, preacher, and many years later, 30 years later, he wrote a little pamphlet called Thoughts on the African Slave Trade, and it was written to help abolish the slave trade in England. In that pamphlet, John Newton wrote, I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. You see, Newton changed his mind. He repented of his days as a slave ship captain. But what makes Newton remarkable as a Christian is not that he was engaged in the slave trade, but that he stopped and later repented. You see, if he had simply remained a slave ship captain, we might never have known about it. And that speaks to how few people actually changed their minds and switched paths on the issue of racism and enslavement. Now, you have to understand more about slavery. So we think about the Middle Passage and we think, well, once they get across the ocean, that's it. They're sold and they go work on plantations. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. You see, they arrived oftentimes in the Caribbean islands, and people would buy human beings, but in small batches. And so folks would go from port to port to port, trying to sell as many enslaved people as possible, so that journey could last weeks and months longer than whatever it took you to get across the Atlantic. And then speaking of selling human beings, in one particularly egregious example of how we treated human beings as less than human, there was something called the Scramble. And so they would put all enslaved persons in this big pen, and it would be locked up and there would be walls so nobody could get out. But then at a certain point, all of the potential buyers, who were white men, they would gather outside the pen, and then someone would ring a bell or shout a word to start, and then people would rush in to this, and this is why they call it a scramble, and they would grab however many human beings they wanted to buy as slaves. And this is a particularly dehumanizing way of selling people. And not only that, once you were sold into another person's ownership, so to speak, you had to be seasoned. This is conditioning to get you ready for life as an enslaved person in a new land. So you had to learn new language, you had to be trained for whatever particular work that you would be doing. And this was a very grueling period. Folks were exposed to new diseases. They were depressed because they were taken from their homelands. They're doing hard, rigorous work for no pay. And many enslaved persons died within the first 3 years. So the story of North American slavery is not the same as everywhere else. Britain, for instance, they abolished the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in 1833. But that doesn't mean they were completely done with it. You see, there was the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and that fed an astronomical demand for raw material. Cotton demand, for instance, grew 20 times during the Industrial Revolution. And that was cotton that was supplied from colonies. As we look more deeply at the North American story of enslavement, one of the historical landmarks that historians have is 1619. That's the year when a Dutch trading ship brought, quote, 20 and odd Negroes to the coast of colonial Virginia. Now, what's a little bit ironic is that the Dutch had stolen these Africans from a Portuguese ship, and the ship was named the São João Bautista, or in English, St. John the Baptist. So again, we're getting these Christian and enslavement interactions again. Now, Europeans had been enslaving Africans in places like Haiti and Jamaica for 100 years, but this marked one of the clearest beginnings of slavery in colonial North America. Slavery gradually took form. In the early days, it looked more like indentured servitude. It was unfree labor. But with indentured servants, most of the time you could marry, you could save money, and of course you could work your way out after a period of years. And early on in the colonial era, Africans were considered potential members of the community on an equal basis with other Europeans. Now, this wasn't uniformly the case, but it was the idea that, are these indentured servants? Are these citizens? Are they something else? But over time, those questions gradually coalesced into what we now recognize as American race-based chattel slavery. Now, there were some causes for those changes, and we got to understand the context because, again, it's the idea that not only slavery is being created, but ideas of race are being created. So there was Bacon's Rebellion, and what that taught the powers that be was the danger of indentured servants rebelling. And so they clamped down and didn't want indentured servants banding together, often across racial lines, in order to foment rebellion. Another factor was a longer life expectancy of slaves. That meant that they were worth the investment. And then lastly, a slow rate of Europeans arriving to the colonies meant that there was a need for labor and Europeans couldn't always supply it, so they looked to African enslaved labor. Slavery got more and more regulated over time. You have something called the Slave Code, and that a person would be determined slave or free based on the mother's status. Now, this is different because typically a child's status would be based on the father. And then there were other factors. They regulated slavery and made it slavery for life. There was no possibility of working your way out in most cases. And they also forbade formal marriage. Now, sometimes people would partner up or have informal ceremonies, but nothing that the authorities had to respect. Now, in the midst of this, Christians, European Christians, wanted to proselytize to the enslaved, Native Americans, Africans, people of mixed race and ethnicity. In a book called The Baptism of Early Virginia by historian Rebecca Ann Getz, she talks about the concept of hereditary hedonism. Just as a parent can pass down genetic traits to their child, the idea of hereditary hedonism is that parents pass down their religion to their child. And so here we get to see how in the colonial era, race becomes tethered to religion. Because what it essentially meant was that Christian equals European, and heathen equals Native American or African. So there's a compelling illustration of this with John Rolfe, who was British, and Metawaka, who was a Native American princess. They got married, and you may know Metawaka better by another name, Pocahontas. Now, what happened was they got married, Metawaka becomes Christian, John Rolfe and she have a child together, and they go back to Europe. And basically, John Rolfe is showing off and saying, see, here's this Native American woman. She marries an upstanding European man. They have a child together, and she becomes a Christian. In other words, there's the possibility that the native inhabitants can become more like Europeans, also adopting religion of the colonizers. And so there's this possibility of Native Americans entering into European society if they take on the right traits. Now, that wasn't always the case. It certainly wasn't in a case of equality for Native Americans, but it was even interesting that Africans never really had such a possibility of becoming white or European as people of other races and ethnicities may have at one time been thought of. What happened with Africans was Christians from Europe still tried to evangelize them. Now, it bears mention that Africans had already been exposed to Christianity. Christianity in Africa predates Christianity in Europe, but many Europeans thought that they were introducing Africans for the first time to Christianity, and so they wanted to evangelize Africans. There was something called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. It was a missionary agency. And there's one missionary in particular whose story I think helps us understand the way race and religion intertwined in the way that Europeans compromised with racism when it came to Christianity. The missionary's name was Francis Lejeune, and he went to South Carolina from 1706 until his death in 1717 to evangelize not only Africans but also Native Americans and anyone who was there. Now, he was passionate about evangelizing, but he also knew that he had to satisfy the plantation owner class. And they were concerned that if you started baptizing people of African descent, well, they're going to get these ideas about freedom and liberty and equality, and we can't have that because we need them to be obedient servants. So here's what Lejeune did. When he did get Africans to convert, he had them baptized, and their baptismal vows said this: "You declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that you do not ask for holy baptism out of any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience you owe to your master while you live, but merely for the good of your soul, and to partake of the grace and blessings promised to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ." You see what happened there? What Lejeune and others were doing was trying to spread the faith without confronting the exploitative economic system of slavery and the merging of social inequality based on race. In other words, they were saying, God can have your soul, but we keep your body. Now listen, race had to be constructed and it could be deconstructed. It had its beginnings in the colonial era. And we can see that actually Christianity helped construct racial categories through ideas like hereditary hedonism, or the idea that you could Christianize and civilize people by marrying into European families. But it's also important to realize that if racism can be made, it can be unmade. History has contingency. People have agency. We can make different choices that lead to racial equality. But that's about the future of the American church. When it comes to its past, the church has compromised with racism.
We have a little bit different crowd than we did last week,
Okay.
but it's good. I mean, I'm sure people will be in and out. So for those who weren't here last week, any thoughts on what you watched, or any questions about what we'll be studying over the next several weeks? Steve, you're new. I mean, really, Jamar Tisby is he's Reformed. He's part of I guess, the Reformed Church. So he went to Reformed Theological Seminary. So he is in the same family as Presbyterian and all that. So he's not outside of what we believe. And he's a historian, a theologian, a pastor. And really, this study is about studying race in America. From today, we talked about racism or slavery starting in colonialism time up until, basically, what's happened in the past year. So that's what this study's about. And, last week, Jamar, he talked about, this is going to be uncomfortable. I know I'm uncomfortable watching it, and I'm uncomfortable talking about it. So if you're uncomfortable listening to it and talking about it, you're not the only ones in the room. I mean, I'm definitely with you there. So you know, there's gonna be a lot of touchy subjects for sure, and there's gonna be things that I personally am not gonna agree with that he says that we study. But I think it'll be good. I think it'll be something that we'll all grow from doing it. So I've been looking forward to do it. You know, getting into this study. We've been talking about it for a while. So.
When do you think he'll start talking about what we're seeing now?
Yeah, it's really split into two parts, the study. The first part is really the history of slavery and racism in America. And then the second part really touches on like the BLM movement and reparations and things like that we've seen in the past year and what's getting talked about today. So yeah, it gets into very contemporary topics, things that are being discussed and things that we got to watch on TV and see in our own community in the past year and a half. So, but it's later on in the series.
But he's looking at it just strictly from their way, though. Right now, and he may be looking at it later, strictly from the way they look at it, and that we're all Caucasians are at fault totally, and you know it's a double thing. Works both ways.
Say more about that. What you mean, like the way he's looking at it?
Well, the way he's looking at it right now, of course, it has to do with past stuff, and of course that was awful.
Right.
No question about that. But I'm just thinking about, say, the way it is basically now. Or is he looking at it that we're totally at fault? Or is he going to be looking at it that they also have their faults?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't watched those videos. I mean, we'll have to find out. But I think what he presents in the first part of the study is a historical view of racism and slavery in the country. So I think it's a pretty objective. He does a good job. It's very objective. And then I think when we get into the BLM movement and some of the more modern things, I mean, I would imagine some of it is objective, some of it may be subjective. I don't know. I don't know which. We'll just have to wait and see what that looks like.
I have a comment about that.
Sure.
He seems to always say the word racism, and he's talking about black versus white, which is what I think I was hearing over here. Racism goes back a long time before that. Or the Egyptians and the Israelis had no problems at all, as we know about, right? So,
Yeah,
so I agree with a lot of things. He also made a point. I mean, he lumped together politics, religion, and race, and then he immediately goes over and he jumps on what I think is the real cause, which is economics. I think almost all slavery is based on I gotta make a buck here.
Right.
So I really think that bears some thinking about too.
You brought up something that I actually kind of highlighted, and I wrote down notes, and this is the second time I watched today's video, was that he said that race was being made, race was socially constructed. Now, I don't disagree with what he was saying. Yeah, I believe that race is socially constructed. I mean, the way we look at people and the prejudices we may have for certain people based on the color of their skin or whatever attributes that they, I mean, that is kind of a socially constructed thing. I just didn't agree with it. This was the first time it was happening, was when Columbus came over. I believe it's been happening since the fall of man. Like you said, is the Egyptians and the Jews is a perfect example of that. They've been one of the most persecuted groups in the history of man. So that's the only thing I disagreed with him on in this video, and maybe I didn't completely understand what he was saying, but I believe that race has been an issue since the fall of man. Yeah, that's just my opinion on that.
And he really does, from what I've seen so far, zone in on African American and white. So is that kind of what you would say, Matt? I mean, that's really the focus of the study, and so he doesn't really touch on the broader sin problem of racism that is so common.
I think going back to what Roger's saying is, you're saying is racism, the door can swing both ways. I mean, whites can be racist to non-whites, and and the opposite can hold true. And I've seen that in my own life, that you'll run into non-whites that are also racist. It's not just a white problem, it's a sin problem, it's a human problem. I wouldn't just pinpoint one group as being the problem, although what we're going to watch in this video is just how just racism period in America, and how we saw it in institutions and in laws and everything else. So, but we'll just have to see how it goes.
To your point, Dr. Edson, I was thinking a lot of this. I grew up in Virginia, and so we had Virginia studies, and we it's a very historical state, and so we learned a lot about things like this growing up. I grew up in a rural area, and so did not have many minorities in my town or anything like that. We probably had 2 or 3 other black kids in the grade levels, very very low minority level. My thought about this was so interesting when he talked about this racism can be made. I guess growing up, and it's weird to think about this, but growing up hearing about things like this, I thought of it as a historical thing, and I didn't really think about, until recent years, just to be honest with y'all, did not think about having a role in unmaking it. That's just not something that crossed my mind, really. Just learned about things like this in a historical way. And even, I'm telling y'all this just to be really honest with you, but even in my town, our mascot, we were the Rebels, just like Ole Miss is in my high school. So, marching band playing Dixie every 10 times a football game. That was just part of our town culture, and it wasn't anything that I thought about as being participatory in or anything like that. Now things changed, and people did speak up about some of those things. Some of it not until really recent years, as has happened everywhere. But I think it's interesting for me to think racism can be made, but it also can be unmade. I honestly, some of that's a new thing for me in my life. I had not thought of my role in unmaking racism. And so I wonder if others feel the same way. I think partly just because that was not my experience, and I wasn't around a lot of minority folks to even think about their perspective or their experience in life.
I grew up over in Taiwan as a kid of a missionary, so I didn't come back to the States till high school. So I was quite frankly shocked by some of the things I saw involving racism. I wasn't exposed to that over there, not near the level of what was going on over here. So it was quite a shock to me, and I got introduced to American football, and in a small southern town where my dad took on a church role there as pastor. I just was not used to the racial hostilities. We were about a third Lumbee and Tuscarora Indian, which was a mixed breed of Indians. They intermarried and ended up there in Robinson County, and about a third black, about a third white. I was immediately befriended by both the Indians and the blacks because of playing football. So I began to go to their parts of the town and their parts of the county with them. And my dad's a pastor, my mom was a pastor's wife, was immediately fit with. We're not sure you condone this kind of behavior. So that was the introduction of just the resistance to races doing things together. me, it took a while to adjust to it, but I guess and so naturally, I think it's natural here that we're dealing more with the black-white racial issue. For me, as I look at it, it is a huge issue, and it's not going to be dealt with or unmade at the national level or at the state or local level. It's going to be understood and dealt with in groups like this. The company I work with, we call them caring conversations, and we are beginning to deal with it within our own company to better understand how do we support one another, how do we work together, and a big part of that is understanding our backgrounds. I've always had a hard time. My dad he dealt with the racial issue on Sunday morning from the pulpit, and it was some of the most emotional times for him because there was a lot of resistance in that church and in the town for those kind of topics to be discussed. What we're doing today, it's not easy, it's not comfortable, and there was a lot of people who didn't want to deal with it. But for me, I listen to podcasts, I read a lot, and it's hard for me to read about the treatment that humans do to other humans and try to understand that. But it's become very difficult and very challenging for me and the company I work with to hear my friends, people I work with, that I meet with, that I build a business with, to talk about the treatment they've been exposed to and what they've had to live with in the towns that they've lived with. It's very emotional. And so for me, I want to do anything I can in this community to try to deal with it, understand it, and if we're going to unmake it, we're going to unmake it together, right? I'm not going to unmake it dealing with it separately. And that's one of the things that used to bother my dad the most, is that where we were, Sunday mornings were usually the most segregated times of any time in that community, because everybody dealt with, they were worshiping together with their own race. And he did a lot of things trying to break that down. Wasn't comfortable, wasn't easy. But anyway, if we're gonna deal with it, we're gonna deal with it together. And the company I work with, we're starting to do that, and there are very uncomfortable, emotional times over us together. But I'm getting a better sense of people I work with and what they've been through, and some of the very difficult times they've had just because of skin color.
Are those people happy for the opportunity to have these conversations?
Yes, very much so. They want it to be dealt with. They want us to deal with it together and work together to fix it as much as we can. Now, whether we can take that outside of the confines and buildings of our company, we don't know, but we're dealing with it there as a company, and it's very uncomfortable. So I think as we go into, as this perhaps does move into the community, as we try to figure out ways to deal with it, yeah, it's very uncomfortable, but they're happy. And those, as they relive the times, as they talk about what they dealt with, what their parents dealt with, what their grandparents dealt with, there's a lot of tears, there's a lot of emotions, there's a lot of better understanding for me. I can't imagine, I think that, to me, an environment where there's no hope, where there's hopelessness, would be the worst environment I could ever imagine. I haven't walked in their shoes. I can't imagine being on a plantation and seeing my parents and my grandparents and what they go through, and realizing that I probably am going to grow up and die doing the same thing, whether it's picking cotton or whatever else it is, that's all I'm going to experience. So I'm trying to do a better job of trying to understand and walk in other people's shoes. And there's a lot that goes on today I disagree with, but I think if I'm going to deal with it and better understand maybe how to deal with it today, I've got to do a better job of understanding the history and what their experience has been, because it's so foreign to me. It's very foreign to me to have those kind of experiences.
Yes.
The bad part about what you're saying to me is you've got to understand the history, but it seems like everybody wants to destroy it. We aren't going to learn anything if we just knock down a statue or change a symbol. This is putting a Band-Aid on heart surgery. These changes are going to have to come inside of us, not these external. Maybe these are little baby steps. I don't know. But don't we learn from history?
Say some more about how you feel like that's been threatened. How you feel like you mentioned the statue.
Oh, I'm just thinking about
yeah.
why tear down Booker T. Washington? He's somebody we ought to admire and say, look at how this man accomplished it, even with all these awful challenges. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think we've gotten right into the council culture right now, and we're
Yeah.
talking about at the end of World War II, when the American soldiers walked around and saw Auschwitz and all of those extermination camps. The first thing they did was they went next door and they got all the Germans and they said, "Come look what the hell you did." Right? Nowadays we're gonna say, we're gonna tear down all of this and we're gonna forget about it. And if we all forget about it, what's gonna stop us from doing it again? So essentially, that's the basis of some of our worries, I think.
Do you think it's because in our culture or society we're really unable to have conversations with one another? I mean, do you think that's the root cause of just wanting to tear it down? Is because we can't?
It's an easy way.
It's an easy way?
I mean,
Yeah.
it's fast, it's easy, it's convenient, but it doesn't solve anything
Right.
because these changes, if they don't come
From within.
within, I don't know how we've made a lot of progress.
Well, it is an emotional issue, and you can't legislate these changes. I mean, there's no law on any level, I believe. However, when you think about change and the pointing of the need for change, look at history. Look at the American Revolution, Boston Tea Party. I mean, we did violent things to get.
Absolutely.
Well, okay, then fast forward. Is this not an attempt to grab America's attention?
That might be the only way to do it. I don't know.
I don't know
That's
either.
why-
I'm just
Because I'm
speculating.
old enough to be an old Martin Luther King follower. And that was a real no-no.
Yeah, but where did that get us?
Holy moly.
It got us a long way. I would
It
think.
got us.
Did it get us
long-
to where we want to be?
No, not at all, but I'm an old woman.
I'm pretty old too.
I
Move
grew
the
up
bar, move the needle pretty far.
I grew up in downtown Atlanta in the 50s. I grew up and I saw some horrible things. Things that if you're not as old as I am, you just can't imagine.
I think the state of Georgia is a third black, more or less. I worked with a Chinese fella in Marietta, and then we told him that only about 13% of the U.S. was black, and he says, that's ridiculous. I've never heard it like in my life. We have, I think, a lot of the black people in the cities, and right now I think they're under a lot of stress, just like the rest of us are for various reasons. Well, probably a lot more than they've ever been in their lifetimes. So we've got a lot of violence going on, I think, because people are just stressed, and they're making this, so maybe this is all getting mixed up, but it's very worrisome to us.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, I'm not advocating this. I'm just thinking maybe that's a strategy somehow. It's an attention grabber.
It's an attention grabber.
Now, I don't know about Booker T. Washington. I don't, but
Well, I'm not that old.
well, they
No,
pulled
no.
down one of the
Yeah, I know
statues.
but I don't know about his statues.
Didn't actually participate in his.
But I know a lot of the statues that they're taking down are associated with the Confederacy.
Absolutely.
And
But
it's a
let's
celebration
keep
of the
it
Confederacy. Well,
there. You know, when I heard that his
keeping versus celebrating.
I tell you what, I grew up on a mill village, and the whites and the blacks were separated. We never thought anything about it. They had a school, we had a school. We had a high school, they had a high school. I worked with blacks. I never had any problem. I delivered papers to the blacks. I collected from the blacks, you know, and we knew each other. I never had a single problem. High school, never had a problem. College, never had a problem. And you know, even in the town, I grew up in the county, but then the town, at the courthouse, They had white restaurants, black restaurants. They had white water fountains, black water fountains. I never thought anything about it because that's just the way it was. And I never really had any problems with racism at all. And then I was in medical school. We had some blacks around, no problem. I have worked with many blacks. I've never had a single problem, ever. I've even been asked to speak at some black retirement things. And, you know, I've never had a problem. Racism is just something that's kind of foreign to me in a way, although it's really awful the way it's hidden, the way it's hid, that's for sure.
I was interested in the baptismal vows that were in the video, where basically, and the way he boiled it down was right. You know, God gets your soul, but we keep your body. And it didn't. I read this book a couple years ago, and I was talking to one of my friends at the gym. He's an African American man. He's a trainer there. Went to Clark Atlanta, big football player. He was successful in all of those ways. I wasn't. So I'm always asking him questions about what it was like to play at an HBCU. He chose to play at a historically black college and university versus going to a larger Division I school and maybe doing more. And I can't remember what had just happened, but we had another issue in Atlanta that was largely along racial lines between black and white folks. And he said, you know, it's sort of like this. You know, you can look back and trace your family back how many generations? And I said, man, I don't know. I can probably trace it back 10, 15. I mean, but when written records were kept, we can pretty much go all the way back to see where we came from. He said, I can go back. I've gone back, and I can only go back 3. And it's because his family didn't exist in the world that we live in, from the standpoint of there being records and lineages and things like that, because they came here, they had their religion, their God, their culture taken from them. They'd been commodified, and his family took on the name of the family that owned him. That's as far back as he could go. And there was this, and as we talked about it, I was asking him, just, you know, did that make you feel unmoored? Do you feel kind of adrift from the standpoint of not knowing, you know, your family's history and its legacy and lineage? And he's a believer, and he said, you know, the difference is, and it's a phrase I'll never forget. He said, you know, you can look at it one of 2 ways. You can see everyone being created in the image of God, or you can see everybody created in the image of us. And that phrase really hit me when he said it, because there's a sense in which we can just without very unconsciously, you know, we just don't see it, because this is our world, and in our world we can all trace back our families, and we can all, you know, we share so much that's a given. And then you encounter a friend and somebody that you deeply love, and you find out that there is pain there, and there has been in ways that you know, we weren't there doing it, but in ways in which if we don't go out of our way to talk about these things and to learn these things, then the image of God remains the image of us if we're not careful. And that's the part about this study that I think is so important for us, and when I say us, I mean me, is to once again go outside of my orbit and go outside of my reality to try to understand and to better love people that I don't know and I don't share this background and this pain with. But it's particularly difficult, I think, even in the private sector too, because we don't have a language in our culture anymore about sin and evil in the image of God and the inherent dignity of humanity. You'll hear those words get thrown around, but our policies don't match that in many ways. And that's, I don't care if you wear a red tie or a blue tie or whatever tie you wear, there's enough evil in each party to go around, in my opinion. But for us to not have that ability to have a common basis by which we say we understand and acknowledge that this is wrong. That's the challenge. And I think it's something though that the church is uniquely positioned to be able to speak into, because we do have that language, we do have that understanding. But based on a lot of his research, it's very much, it's something that we get cold feet, I think, sometimes about that. So, yeah.
Another thing too, I was in the military corps, and I would work in the infantry, and I never saw any racism at all. I mean, we didn't have blacks and whites; we had everybody together, and we were out doing all kind of things, and people getting shot and killed, so forth. But I never saw any racism in the military. I'm sure there probably was some. I never saw it.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that, when you're all together in that sense, and it's a life or death thing, I bet there's no Catholic or Protestant. I bet people don't care what part of the country you're from.
All those divisions are broken down.
All of those walls that are constructed in a lot of ways probably just, they all go away. Hey, yeah, there you go. It's that old saying, there's no atheist in a foxhole. Yeah.
Is there anything else that stood
How
out?
are we going to get to a point? How do we do this?
Yeah.
How do we get past Martin Luther King era?
How do we get to his ideals, what you said,
Yeah.
all men are brothers and all this? These wonderful speeches that he gave, and they're wonderful ideals. They sound good. Let's do it.
Let's practice it. The only thing is the country's gotten so far away from his principles.
Yeah, that's the biggest issue I have, is that some of these more modern movements don't seem to be in line with what he was preaching. They're more violent, and I have issue with that. But I agree. I mean, those are the ideals that the foundation was laid on, and we just need to continue to build
That's
on.
how do we get it back? How do we have these people, instead of taking fire to buildings,
Right.
carry their Bibles like they did?
Do you think most white Americans buy into Martin Luther King?
I think a lot
It's
more of them do now than they did.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, more now than then?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think so. What do you think?
Absolutely.
I don't know about that.
No.
Really?
Oh,
Tell me your name again. I'm so sorry.
Susan.
Susan. Okay, sorry. No, I was actually going to say something along those lines of, I think it's when you say, how do we get back to these ideals of Martin Luther King, I think it's really interesting to consider perspective, in that what you may have been feeling as a white American during those times is very different than someone like my grandmother was feeling during those times, where this might have been a national conversation, but going back to what Mr. Dunn was saying, it's not a community conversation necessarily.
you're right.
And so you may be having it globally or nationally, but if you're not having it in your community, then there's no real effect there. And I think it's also important to consider history and context. We talk about, history is perspective, and everybody's perspective is different. So what you hear is going to be the popular perspective. It's not always everyone's true reality. And I think that acknowledging that not all history is universal necessarily. I mean, obviously there are some facts that are true, but I think it's, I think about like living here in Dalton. I personally never really experienced racism, but I think about my grandmother, who did not go into the Wink Theater until the early 2000s, where she was, it's a theater in town, where in...
Oh, I'm going. Who's your grandmother? I may know her.
It's Tenny Dwight.
Okay.
But I remember they had an event there at the theater, and she told us, she said, this is the first time I've ever been in this theater where I've been allowed to sit on the floor. I've always had to sit upstairs.
Wow.
But we think it's so far gone, and she's a generation away from me. Like, you know, she's someone who practically raised me. So I think it's nice to think that it was a long time ago, and it's nice to think that we've like strayed away from these ideals, but like we really haven't. It's really all still here. It never really changed. It might have changed like, what's the word? Like you might have think it changed because like conversations are starting to happen, but those conversations weren't happening at every house.
Oh no, they weren't happening in my house. I was the black sheep out in the middle of stuff. Believe me, it was not. It didn't find a lot of favor in my family.
Yeah, and I would say this too, just coming from, you know, it's the way that there's a guard up from African Americans, where there have been national movements, but then you come to like a small community where like they don't necessarily feel like things have changed. I mean, like Mr. Dunn, you saying that y'all have these conversations, your company, that's like mind blowing to me.
It's unique, I think.
That is like, I'm like, tell me more about this. This is fantastic, because I don't think that is
worth a shot.
But what's wonderful about, well, what's inspiring about that is that it's wonderful that a company can do it, but we're talking about, can the church do that? Not even, I love the word, what you call it, carrying conversation, because the whole fact of it is just somebody caring enough to just sit and listen to other people, because, you know, Jasmine and I are almost the same age. It's things that are new to me, even though my parents are y'all's age. These are things that are new to me just because we didn't have those kind of personal
conversations. And that's what I'm saying. Like, these things are happening in the '60s, but we're just now in 2021 having environments where we can have caring conversations. That's a really long time.
Oh yeah.
For that progress to have been made.
It's back to one of the comments Susan made. There is such a desire for progress. I mean, if I was in a position where my parents had been talking about it, I had been talking about it, and had seen such little progress that we've made, now to the point that anger and frustration is blowing over, and there are statues being torn down, and there are buildings and businesses being ruined, but there is such a strong desire for progress. And so I think it's just the realization that it's not going to be dealt with in huge groups. We're not going to gather at the Trade Center and figure this thing out. We're going to figure it out here and in small rooms and within a business. But we got to deal with it, and it is uncomfortable. And at least friends that I have that I'm better understanding what they've been through are saying, we want to talk about it, and we want to listen to you, and we want to deal with this together. So.
And the church should be.
Yes,
leading the
absolutely.
way, right?
The church should be leading the way.
Doesn't feel like the church is involved. I mean, like I guess this is one of the reasons Matt brought this. Yeah, see you, Roger. Thanks for coming. I think this is one of the reasons why we did have this conversation about doing this study, is because all this stuff happened over the summer, and of course we're all locked in our houses, and we really haven't had a time to talk about it. And and this was really the first opportunity we could have to really have these discussions. And I don't know, maybe there's other churches doing like similar things, but I'm not certain about that.
Yeah, there are, and it's not, when we talk about the church, it sounds like the capital C church, and I think even as Tisby talks, he's not talking about to try to paint it as all a broad brush. There are churches that have been working for this for decades and decades, and trying to push these conversations and trying to that are in our own tradition, but they're few and far between what I'm finding is that, you know, most of the pastors that are my age and some that are older, but certainly those that are younger, really are pushing to start having these kinds of conversations, because, you know, Dr. King's legacy is Christ's legacy. You know, his teaching, it wasn't, I mean, we know his history, and we know that his teaching was based on the Gospels and all of Scripture for that matter. But that, when you look at that movement that was rooted in the truth and what we know to be true, look at how that movement and how other movements that were going on at the time, the long-lasting legacy of his versus others that came and went in many senses. And that's what I think the hope that we have is that we do have Christ and we do have the Holy Spirit, and we're absolutely right. You can't legislate this out, although I think legislation needs to happen. We can't, you know, we can't erase history, but we certainly can talk about all sides of it, not just one particular side of it. But most of all, we have the power that brings Christ back from the dead in us. And that's a power that then generates these conversations that then, and it's the concentric circles. I would love that every Christian in every church, you know, we have to go find a place big enough to hold us, and that everybody in there would be in there for the same reason and would come out with the same conclusions. But this, much of what we're talking about is so deeply ingrained and rooted, and things have gotten twisted around to where words that mean certain things to certain people don't mean the same thing, and our experience is all tangled up in this. And for me, I think this is hopefully, you know, us having both the willingness to have the conversation, but then also saying, okay, so what do we do individually and collectively as a church on South Tipped Road? What's our role in this, and how do we move forward intentionally? And so that's and I think I said it a couple weeks ago. I don't follow Tisby everywhere he goes, you know, but I don't follow Luther everywhere he goes. I don't follow C.S. Lewis everywhere he goes. I don't, you know, no one's perfect in their assessment of these things, but I agree with them more than I don't on most of this stuff. So it's exciting though to be able to have these conversations. So, but well, I want to be respectful of your time. Oh, I'm sorry.
One more statement. I'm praying this is what it's all about. We're so desperate to make progress. I think we are just desperate to make progress. It's taken so long and people have fought so hard. How can we do it? I look to the Lord. How do I do it?
Is it a revolution?
I don't know. I'm just, part of me is really desperate to see some kind of harmony.
I don't think that you can, I mean, it's just my opinion, obviously, but I don't think it's hard to look at it in terms of like changing the world. I think it's so much more about changing yourself and understanding that I can't control how you feel about race. All I can do is control how I feel about race and hope that if it's a positive way that I feel about it, that it rubs off on you some. And I think that the biggest thing that, you know, we've talked, you know, how can you change, how can you do this? So much of it is just listening and understanding that you don't actually know anything about like how other people feel, you know, and I don't mean everybody, but but for the most part, if you have, I'll use myself as an example. Like I grew up a white kid in a town that had 20 black kids in my school, and they hung out with themselves, and we interacted with them and stuff like that. But it wasn't like, I can say like I wasn't racist, that kind of stuff. But I didn't know what they were going through, and I just assumed they had the same life that I had, and and that their dad did the same job that my dad had, and all that kind of stuff. And so it really wasn't until I met Jasmine's family and met them more than surface level and understood this is the reason why you feel this way about this thing. It's not, and I think as a human race, you get so defensive if somebody thinks differently of you. You know, it's, well, why do they want to do this and that and this and that? I don't feel that way about that and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, to actually take a second, walk a mile in their shoes, to be like, oh, like this is you're rooting and you're looting or rioting, not looting, but you're rioting because you're sick of it. You've been dealing with crap since the time that your family was brought over here on a ship against their will, you know. And it's like, and having it, that's, you know, a dramatic example, but it's even little things like understanding that I don't understand, but I want to understand, is how I think that you change it. You don't try to change the world with it. You don't, like, you know, have some giant goal of that. If you can start with changing yourself, of realizing that there are some, you know, prejudices that you don't even realize that are in your body, and to be able to acknowledge those, and just like, you know, if you know, you're walking down the aisle and you see a big black guy walking down the aisle, like, I'm gonna go down the other aisle, and then you look back like, why did you do that? Did I think this black guy was gonna punch me in the face because I'm a white guy? It's like, and then you feel like, you look back and it's ridiculous. That's like, you know, the color of this guy's skin, you know, that I felt that way, and I don't even know if that actually happened or not, but that's just an example, you know, like, or the old, like, you know, walk across the street because some, you know, a couple black kids are walking the street, I'm gonna go across the street and walk on the other sidewalk. Like, it's so awkward. Like, why do you do that kind of thing? And it's that you don't even, it's the unconscious prejudice and racism that you don't even realize that you have to really open up and understand that you know nothing, and almost start over, which is so hard to do at any age, you know.
Absolutely.
Especially as you get older, to realize I don't really, like, you know, and not to, I'm sorry that Dr. Edson Lux, I would have said this with him in here, but when he was talking about, you know, there was two different, you know, there's a black thing, a white thing, black and white thing, and that, you know, he didn't see racism, and that's fine, that's his experience. But I guarantee the people drinking out of the crappy old water fountain felt racism. You know, the people in the toilet that didn't work, they felt racism, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so it's the understanding that even though you didn't feel it, you don't have any anger towards a person of different race. I mean, that's a good, but that's just like a baseline. It's going further, understanding that, yeah, maybe the guy who had the, you know, didn't quite have it, you know, on the you know, heads up way, maybe feels a little bit different, and the understanding of why he feels different.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it does. I think it starts, all the cliches, but it does start with a willingness to examine my own grid.
Yeah.
And be willing to say, okay, where do I have blind spots?
Yeah.
But blind spots are hard to acknowledge because they're blind spots.
Yeah.
But I do think you're right. I think that, you know, in this, the goal is transformation.
Yeah.
That's what the Holy Spirit is about, is creating a clean heart in us and renewing our spirit. You know, what David prays in Psalm 51, but that process of getting there means pulling off a lot of layers that are assumed and inherited and that I'm frankly quite comfortable with.
Yeah.
But to get there, that's what it takes.
And that's what and I've always kind of thought this as a personal gauge of, you know, we're going to have some really hard talks. We're going to have some really hard this or uncomfortable this. Until you can get to the point internally where it's not hard and not uncomfortable, that's when, like, I feel like me personally, I feel like I'm like 50% of the way there. Like, I don't think I've got this whole race thing figured out. I've got a lot to learn. But it's like, I've at least gotten to where, like, I don't feel awkward talking with, like, Jasmine's grandmother about a race thing. It doesn't come up that often. But, you know, like, I've had some conversations with, like, her aunt one time. We were going somewhere, just the two of us. And it was right around when some young black teenager got shot and killed, and we just, you know, she's asking me about it, my opinion on all that kind of stuff. She has a young black teenager at the time, you know, and so it's like,
she's asking us about raising Charlie.
Oh yeah, that's right, yeah.
And saying, you know, I've had this question more than I care to admit because it just like irritates me. But I remember somebody asking me one day, like, how will you raise Charlie? Will you raise him like as a black kid? And I was like, I'm gonna raise him as a child of God to the best of my ability, first and foremost. He will know my family, of course, but what is that? I can't do that for him.
Right.
raise him as just the same way I can't raise him as an all white child. Like
Right.
he is a multitude of these things. That's who he is. And I heard something the other day that in terms of race, and it was the discussion about whether Jesus is white or not. And the person responded with, it is not the level of melanin in Jesus' skin that cures us of our sins. It is what he did on the cross. Those things don't matter. And that's how I want to raise my kids. So anyways, sorry, I stole your spotlight.
Well, listen, great conversation, y'all. Thank you for coming. We'll be doing it again next week, 4:30. But let me pray for us, and then we can break. Father, thank you that you love us, and thank you that you call us to step outside of ourselves and our traditions and the ways that we see things, to understand how you see things. And so often that process is something that we avoid, or we just don't. We don't have the energy to do, or don't feel like we have the time. And Father, we thank you for seasons of the year like Lent that you set aside in the church calendar for us to do the very thing we're talking about, is to be willing to look into our hearts and to look into our lives to see those places that you need to continue to work in us and through us. And thank you for this time, and thank you for Dr. Tisby's study, and Father, just for the ways that it's already generating a consciousness and a willingness to go deeper into this together. And we thank you for your love and for your Son. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank y'all for being here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Turn this off.
Uh-oh, they're on record now.
It's on the record.
On the dog. You better watch
The whole
that
world
so
to
you
see.
get your-
Last way.